In this last lecture for week 4, we're going to talk about the faith of the founders, this idea of Christian America, and then we're going to talk in the end about the inconsistencies of this early Republican American ideal and the reality of slavery in American life that we're going to have to really spend the next several weeks fleshing out and struggling with in our own understanding of the church and its role in the colonial American life. One of the most important things that we have to contend with in the present is this ongoing discussion of quote-unquote Christian America. Was the United States founded as a Christian nation or not? And what does one mean when one says that one believes in a Christian nation or a Christian America? I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit for you tonight and explain what that means, because normally the language of Christian America is tied up in a contemporary understanding of Christian nationalism, which is the relationship between the church and the world in a very unique way in the late 20th and 21st century. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the faith of the founders themselves, and then use that as a bridge to ask broader questions about Christian America and how we should think about this period in its relationship to the broader sweep of American history. Most of the founders were sincerely Christian in some way, right? They were sincere in their Christian identity in some way, but, authentically, you really can't call someone an atheist until about the second half of the 19th century. It's not really an intellectual or cultural viability for at least another century after the American Revolution. So all of the founders would have thought of themselves as Christian, but they would have thought very different things by the meaning of that particular term. The myth of Christian America has to be interrupted by the fact that while it might have been Christian, they all didn't mean the same thing. So, first of all, several of the founders of the United States, and by founders I mean those that were involved in signing the Declaration of Independence and who wrote the Constitution, several of them were actually truly what you would call evangelical in their conviction, their understanding, their experience, and their theology. I think primarily of the four key people. One was John Witherspoon. We've already talked about him. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then Patrick Henry, who very famously gave that speech before the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he proclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death." But the leading founders, the ones that actually are the household names that were involved in the central construction, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and the structuring of the American Constitution, were actually extremely less traditional in their understanding of the Christian religion. Benjamin Franklin actually believed that Jesus was a model for humanity, but certainly not the Son of God. He was more of an Enlightenment empiricist who believed that Jesus was a moral exemplar, but certainly not divine. George Washington was a low church Anglican. As far as we can tell, he never took communion. He prayed standing up instead of kneeling, and he actually rarely went to church. Thomas Jefferson was denounced as an infidel in the election of 1800 and underwent sort of a deistic conversion to a new understanding of the Christian faith as a result of that experience. His growing conviction was that a Republican government needed a strong moral framework, not one that was actually provided by the ancient Greeks, and that framework was provided by a demythologized Christianity. Guided by a friend of his, Unitarian Joseph Priestley, he rejected the Trinity. He denounced miracles as a violation of the laws of nature. He even published a version of the Bible where he literally, with a pair of scissors, maybe an X-Acto blade, actually just cut out the miracles and cut and pasted it into an understanding of the Bible without the miraculous in it. He saw Jesus as a moral guide. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, graduate of Princeton, where he studied divinity, among other things. He affirmed the full separation of church and state, and like Jefferson, was a deist. He believed in nature's God, and while he was more respectful of traditional religion than Jefferson, he still did not affirm what you would call orthodox evangelical Christianity. The way that Mark Knoll put it was this way: James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, joined his colleague and friend Thomas Jefferson in trying to remove the sphere of government from all dealings with churches and formal expressions of Christianity. These were advocates of deism, of nature's God, of a God who may have created the universe, but sent it spinning under its own energy and created the laws of nature and of science that were uncovered by the Enlightenment experience to understand how those operations of nature work according to the laws of nature. As a result of that, it's really not all that helpful. If you mean that America was founded as a Christian nation, you have to understand which Christianity. This argument for a Christian America is actually part and parcel of an understanding of American Christian nationalism that I'll introduce at the end of tonight's lecture, that we'll use as a springboard to talking about in class this coming week. Before we get going further, I want to talk a little bit too about, I want to end our conversation tonight with a discussion of the relationship between slavery, Christian republicanism, and the American Revolution. David George actually ran away from his slave birthplace in Virginia. He served as a servant among Natchez Indians for a time, and then was eventually sold to a plantation on the Savannah River. He converted to Christianity, and he became pastor of a centrally important institution in colonial African Christian experience called, Silver Bluff Church. Silver Bluff Church was located in South Carolina, not far from Savannah, Georgia. When Britain occupied nearby Savannah, Georgia's patriot owner abandoned the area, and so David George and his followers actually moved to Savannah, where he was protected by British soldiers, and he preached there for 3 years during the American Revolution. He eventually, with protection from the British who were retreating after the end of the Revolution, went to Nova Scotia and established black churches there that exist to this day, eventually migrating to Sierra Leone and established the first Baptist church in West Africa. In addition to David George, there's George Liele, who's pictured on your slide. One of George's co-workers at both Silver Bluff and then in Savannah was George Liele, the slave of a Baptist deacon named Henry Sharp. After a white minister introduced Liele to Christianity, his master encouraged him to exhort fellow slaves. Again, this was a Christian master who thought slavery could be used to subdue and educate slaves, that this was their rightful place in life. Before the British occupation of Savannah began, Deacon Sharp, a loyalist, actually liberated Liele, and he joined the tide of blacks who were streaming into Savannah, where they were promised freedom by the British military governor. Like George, Liele left Savannah when the British occupation came to an end, but he did not go to Nova Scotia like David George. Instead, his destination was Jamaica. In Kingston, Jamaica, Liele established a church that soon flourished, attracting nearly 350 members by 1791. Its members were mostly former slaves and slaves, but it also included a few free blacks. So the revolution, which white patriots regarded as a struggle for freedom from Britain, became, at least for a few African Americans, an occasion for freedom in America. The sphere in which that first freedom for African Americans was tasted was first and most powerfully exercised within the church. Here it's important to recognize that what white slave owners meant as a tool for control and subduing was reverse engineered by former slaves and black leaders themselves to be a tool and a message of freedom, of liberation, of empowerment, a new understanding of the way Christianity could be used in the life of the slave and the former slave. Of course, many people saw the hypocrisy of republicanism, arguing of the threat of enslavement to England while they enslaved millions, not quite millions yet, but hundreds of thousands of black slaves in North America. The principles of Americans' founding documents, like the principles of Christianity, could be put to use for human liberation, but they could also be twisted to justify the status quo between masters and slaves. And it was an ex-slave, Frederick Douglass, who I want to end our lecture with tonight, who took this opinion much later now. This is nearly a century later. But he's the one who put voice to this understanding of the inconsistency of slavery being used both to justify of Christianity being used to justify the order and structure of the universe that empowers and equips slavery as an institution for Christian control. On July 4th of 1852, Frederick Douglass gave a very famous public talk called "What to a Slave is the 4th of July?" Would it be that we had a recording of this? But I thought I would just read it, at least a section of it, and let these words wash over you as we end our discussion tonight. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism a sham, your humanity a base pretense, and your Christianity a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion, and it makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it, and yet you cling to it, as if it were the sheet anchor of all your hopes. Oh, be warned, a horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 million crush and destroy it forever. There's a horrible inconsistency in America's founding identity as a slave republic, the great oxymoron of American history. And unfortunately, Christian principles in the melding of Christianity and republicanism were used both to justify and to challenge the institution of slavery. As we get now into the Second Great Awakening, we will see actually the seeds planted by Samuel Hopkins and others that flower into an all-out abolitionism on the part of many evangelicals. But as evangelicalism spreads into the Deep South, it takes on a racialized Christian nationalism in the Deep South that, moving from the 19th into the 20th century, creates many of the contours of today's Christian nationalism. So I end tonight with a brief discussion of Christian nationalism that I want to bring into the classroom when we talk on Tuesday evening. Today's Christian nationalism is founded on a handful of basic principles. The first is that the United States is a Christian nation. Again, this myth of a Christian nation, founded on Christian principles, and that we should uphold them personally, in the church, and in public and government through legislation. that religious influence should be in the government as well as the individual, and you should use the government and legislative power for good. Clearly illustrated, for example, in the stacking of the Supreme Court to end the U.S. practice of abortion. This was a Christian nationalist agenda since the passing of Roe v. Wade in the early 1970s. It also opposes cultural secularism, the idea that Christ has been thrown out of our public life, which is why Oklahoma is now mandating a Bible in every classroom. The Ten Commandments are being put on school classroom walls. This idea that the secular will be the undoing of our country. And again, God blesses us as a nation based on our obedience to God. It also follows a cultural and political conservatism. It melds political conservatism with religious conservatism so that God is actually an advocate of small government, low taxes, individual freedom, individualism in general, right? That melding of faith and politics. It also says that patriotism is a spiritual duty. In the state of Texas, you actually cannot teach about the history and legacy of racism because it's seen as un-American in the public classroom. And finally, oftentimes Christian nationalism is racialized. It is the supremacy of a white European American heritage and is thus oftentimes anti-immigrant. It is this understanding of today's Christian nationalism that I actually happen to believe is the biggest enemy of the Christian tradition in the world, or at least in America today. And I think that we should talk about it carefully in class on Tuesday as the legacy of a lot of the thoughts and ideas that came up in the Great Awakening and into the early stages of the American Revolution that then carried through and will follow that trajectory of thought through the 19th century as well. So as we get ready for class on Tuesday night, we'll talk about Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and the Great Awakening. We'll also talk about Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, Isaac Backus and what became known as the Bill of Rights, and then we'll eventually also talk about Christian nationalism. I look forward to a vibrant and engaging conversation. See you soon.